I'm Slava Silva. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today, I'm talking to Dr. Alan MacLeod, staff writer for MintPress News. You have published two books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. Moreover, you have contributed to Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, The Guardian, Salon, The Grey Zone, Jacobin Magazine, Common Dreams, The American Herald Tribune, and The Canary. Welcome back to the show, Alan.
Good to be back with you.
First, I would like to talk about the case of Julian Assange. Could you please explain what he is charged with and what the extradition hearing is about?
Well, Assange is currently facing an extradition hearing to the United States just now. If sent to the US, he does face 175 years in jail. He's accused of espionage, of breaking laws and encouraging people to leak documents to him or hack a US government computer. For me, I think that is rather an interesting charge because he is, of course, an Australian living across the other side of the world. And so it is odd, I think, that the United States sees itself as having jurisdiction to pull anyone from around the world over to the US to face trial. I think the implications for this trial are probably more important than the trial itself. As many people have pointed out, human rights groups, writers, academics, the actual wording of the indictment that the US uses makes it pretty clear that a lot of standard journalistic practices, like using encryption to talk to sources, hiding sources' names, that sort of thing, seems to be illegal in their eyes. And of course, leaked documents are the absolute lifeblood of journalism. And so it could be the case that this law could be interpreted as essentially criminalizing all investigative journalism. Now, we're speaking just now, not long after the New York Times released an 11,000-word article which detailed Donald Trump's taxes and how he's paid virtually nothing for years and years. Where did they get those documents from? I mean, that's the sort of investigative journalism that could potentially be criminalized under these new precedents that the United States is trying to set. And I think that is quite a dangerous thing for the future of journalism, which is why so many people are following this case so closely.
But not that much of a corporate media, as you have pointed out in a recent article in Fair, and not all of journalism groups. How do you explain that?
Well, 10 years ago when Assange partnered with many of these corporate media outlets like The Guardian, like the New York Times, like Der Spiegel or El País or Le Monde, they were quite happy to take his documents knowing that this was just a treasure trove of information. But in the few years after that, I think big governments around the world realized that this was a very dangerous thing to be happening for them, that their secrets could be published in such prestigious journals and spread all around the world. And they really tried to clamp back down on that. And so we saw this campaign of demonization against Assange and Wikileaks, a campaign to try to criminalize him, to arrest him. He, of course, had to spend 7 years in an embassy in London. And we've seen a sort of slow shift over the past few years of editorial boards like the New York Times and Guardian starting to really sour on Assange. And we've got to the point where when we actually look at the coverage now of his extradition hearing, it's pretty minimal. I mean, the New York Times has only published 2 articles on this. Neither of them gave any sort of hint that Assange was one of their key partners many years ago. And they sort of, washed their hands of it. The Guardian, considering that their headquarters is less than 2 miles from the Old Bailey courthouse, hasn't really done too much better. They do have more articles, but certainly they've not not really defended him in this case. And certainly they're not talking about, they're not really raising the alarm for what it means for the future of media. And I think that's because there's a huge gulf between media owned and operated by international corporations and funded by them too, and media that really serves to try to inform the public and take an adversarial role. And over the past few years, certainly with the rise of the internet, those spheres, the alternative media and the corporate media, have really grown apart to the point where there's very few people with a foot in one and a foot in the other. It tends to be one or the other. And I think that really explains why there's so much disinterest in this trial for corporate media, because they frankly see Assange as, if not a threat, at least a nuisance, and they'd probably be better off if he just went away and they could continue their cozy relationships with big governments instead of trying to expose them.
You see access journalism as a factor here. And could you please talk about the other side of the medal, namely the independent, non-corporate media? We both have spoken to one such journalist, Tarek Haddad, who is covering the proceedings.
Well, I'll give corporate media a little bit of slack here. It is actually really hard to follow the Assange case. The government has made it extremely difficult to go to the courtroom. Only a handful of journalists are let in every day. And that's not even to the courtroom. They're taken up to the top floor in a small room where they watch a very old television, which is a live cam of what's going on in the courthouse. If you want to watch online, you can do that, but you have to sign in between 9:30 and 9:40, and your internet connection cannot drop. Otherwise, you're out of the system. And so it is actually very difficult to get live updates from what's going on. Nevertheless, as you said, there are quite a few journalists actually doing this, but very, very few of them are from well-known established outlets. They tend to be writing for outlets that are really on the margins, tend to be online only, or sometimes foreign media. So as you said, Tarek Haddad is covering people like Kevin Gostola or Mohammed Almazi. But these journalists, even though they're writing good stuff in the public interest, they're not really reaching a broad audience. And I think that's because, as I said, big media outlets really don't particularly want this story to be a nationwide scandal that everybody's talking about, because it kind of exposes a little bit the media's game, frankly. It doesn't really paint big corporate media in a good light either. It certainly doesn't do the same for big government. But yeah, the Assange case, the Wikileaks case, kind of shows how a very small publisher can completely one-up huge outlets with enormous resources and provide story after story in the public interest. And that's what WikiLeaks has done for over 10 years now.
I'm wondering, we have touched on this topic before, namely that the world is ruled by force. How much does it change whether this proceeding takes place or whether it doesn't take place? Will the United States and allied governments not do their best to go after Assange and journalists involved in similar activities, even if there is no precedent set here?
Absolutely, that's a great point. I mean, this is really about sending a message to other journalists, sending a message to future leakers, future hackers. That's why leakers and whistleblowers were persecuted so much under the Obama administration. They realized that now in this era where everybody, where tens of thousands of people in the US, NSA employees, FBI employees, all of these government employees have access to classified, confidential information that could make the government look very bad if it came out. That's why they have to persecute them so strongly. And of course, the Assange case is like that. They're really trying to send a message. In fact, ex-CIA Director Leon Panetta used that exact phrase to describe why the US is pursuing this case. But certainly, this is not the only time that journalists have been persecuted or gone after by big governments. I mean, the obvious example is what Assange and Chelsea Manning exposed in their Collateral Murder video, which showed American Apache helicopter pilots calmly and very in cold blood gunning down civilians, including 2 Reuters journalists. And we saw this throughout the Iraq and Afghanistan wars as well, where Al Jazeera essentially became an enemy of the United States, where their journalists were constantly attacked. Their hotels where they stayed were, plowed with shells. So this is not the first time that the United States or any government really has gone after journalists. And in some cases, there are much more extreme examples, but this one seems to have caught the public attention.
You have a rather skeptical view of the corporate media. How do you respond to, for example, Brian Stelter saying that he does not watch the ads airing on CNN, his network, and therefore he is not doing the bidding of those corporations? And I'm sure many of the journalists working in big corporate outlets would insist that they are there for the public good. Also at the BBC.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't work quite like that. It's more a confluence of interests, really. For a start, journalists nowadays, if you want to be a journalist, it's not like the old days where you would leave school at 16 and get a job in a print works and work your way up. Nowadays, you really have to commit to going to an elite institution like Oxford University or Columbia Journalism School or wherever you are. There's alternatives all around the world. And you tend to have to pay large amounts of money to do these courses. And then that's not even you having a job. Now you have to do 6 months or a year in London or Washington, D.C. or New York or Tokyo or somewhere like that. Very expensive cities to live. And this really filters out people from sort of more modest socioeconomic backgrounds. A lot of the time, it's also who you know. If you've got a relative who works in these things, if you've got an influential friend that can maybe open doors for you. So again, we have a situation where journalists really are increasingly coming from a very small pool of the country. And while I'm sure that CNN journalists don't actually watch the advertisements and think, well, I can't talk about them, they do have years of experience and stuff that their supervisors, their managers, and their editors will look back on. And if you are seen to be rocking the boat or asking too many questions, you simply won't get that promotion. You won't have your contract renewed. And so what happens is the people who please their bosses, who are the owners of the company and the big advertisers, ultimately are the ones that will rise up the chain. And the people who are really questioning power, questioning authority, tend to be at least stagnated at wherever they are, or quite often actually just quietly jettisoned, because nowadays journalism is a very precarious profession. People don't have lifetime contracts. They're working, if lucky, if they're lucky, they're doing 6 months on a contract, or they're just pitching to various outlets. And so if you push a narrative or step on certain red lines, you're simply not going to be invited back into the halls of power. And so that's kind of how it works. So while journalists at the top of the corporate tree certainly don't think of themselves as propagandists, ultimately, if they did believe anything else, they probably would never have gotten to the point that they actually are at.
Noam Chomsky pursued this line of argument in that famous interview with BBC's Andrew Marr. And those people would probably also not end up being a target of the US government the way it has happened with Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning.
No, I mean, most journalists don't really work on particularly sensitive subjects, do they? You know, they're writing about sport or local issues or what have you. But it does send a message to people working in the sort of more political fields that certain things will probably not be tolerated. And this sort of comes into a more sort of feeling that, you know, you don't have to be told this, but you just think, oh, that person's not one of us, that person's, you know, not to be trusted. And so these people get a sort of black mark against them without even really having people to explain it, really. It's just sort of like, maybe stay away from that person. And so I think a lot of people say that, you know, this is going to have profound consequences for the media if Assange is indeed extradited. But, you know, frankly, I'm not sure about that, because I think so few people at the New York Times or CNN or the BBC or whatever are actually challenging power that much to the point where that might happen to them. So frankly, I think this is much more worrying for people working in alternative media rather than for big corporations.